I'm Inez Stepman.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Will Chamberlain.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. So obviously the most important news of the week is the Trump conviction in New York. So we're going to spend most of this show talking about that. And at the end, we're going to transfer a little bit to talk about the second political trial that will be going on, which is Hunter Biden in Delaware. So yeah, I mean, for purposes of this discussion, we're going to be discussing obviously the verdict itself, sort of the myriad of due process and structural problems with the trial, the political fallout, long-term consequences. I mean, I was saying right before we started this episode that I feel like we've all used the word Rubicon 700 times in the last 3 months of this podcast, but we will continue to use it more than likely. And once we feel like we've thoroughly covered that, we'll move to the Hunter trial. So with that, I think I'll kick it off by saying, just summarizing, we all know what happened. We had a conviction. We'll say at the front that Ben was right last week and I was wrong about the Manhattan jury convicting. Although I will, just to kick off the discussion, and I know we'll talk a lot about the various due process problems with this trial. Excuse me. But one of the issues, one of the many issues, is the fact that the charging instructions were so one-sided, like more like a map to conviction to anything else than anything else, that I do think that has a huge role to play. And we knew that the judge in this case was incredibly biased. But what do you think about this? What do you let's start off with the trial itself before we move to sort of the political consequences, whether or not Trump will go to jail, all of those kinds of questions. But what do you think about the trial itself, and what are I'm not going to ask the question, do you think there was something wrong with the trial? Because we all know there was, but maybe we take a moment to discuss some of the things that were wrong with the trial.
Yeah. I mean, the trial was really a stain on the American justice system. I think that's the simplest way to put it. And I think, it's interesting to kind of think about how different the reaction was between, while the trial was going on, people were angry about it, but not this angry. But it's like the moment the conviction came down, it just exploded. And I think there's just this lingering residue in American life that thinks, okay, even if there's an unfair trial, and even if the prosecutor's out to get the defendant, and even the judge is unfair, even if it's an unfair jury, it's like there'll be one of the guys, it's like a 12 Angry Man scenario. There'll be one, stand-up juror who says, no, this is wrong, there's not a conviction here, and it'll stop. And I think it was the moment of conviction last week was the moment you realize, oh no, no one's coming to save us, or at least in the short term. Like the justice system is really corrupt. I think you identified, I mean, there are so many distinct problems, but the most obvious one is with the jury instructions, and the failure to properly instruct the jury on what they needed to find. Because the crime that was charged, it's actually, many people think, and this is a common misconception I see, is that there was this predicate crime that was not specified, and it's actually a little more convoluted than that. Here's the way the logic worked. It was the crime, he was ultimately charged with a felony falsifications of business records. To be a felony, it required that the falsification be in service of a different felony. The different felony was New York state election law, right? A violation of, promoting a candidate via unlawful means. That predicate crime itself contains this predicate of unlawful means. And there was where the judge let essentially the jurors pick from a menu of tax fraud, further falsification of records, or federal election crimes. So what should have happened is the judge should have instructed, like, you need to find the elements of 3 distinct crimes beyond a reasonable doubt in order to find the defendant guilty. And he needed to identify what those elements were. And that didn't happen in the jury instructions at all. It was a mismatch. And there's also the failure to have a special verdict form, which probably would have been necessary to effectively ensure that the jurors, if they were finding Trump guilty the first time, were agreeing that he was guilty of all these predicate crimes in the initial thing. So the jury instructions were flawed. And then I'll pass it around after one other point, but really, there is no way this should have been allowed to go forward in the first place, because some of the elements necessarily of this crime were going to be reliant on Michael Cohen's testimony. And Michael Cohen was a convicted perjurer. He was necessary to speak to Trump's intent and understanding of what he was doing. And the guy had demonstrated he's willing to lie under oath repeatedly. He should never have been allowed to go forward, and this should have been dismissed outright. But obviously, Judge Merchan is horribly biased. He literally raised his hand to be the Biden donor. And now, obviously that's why we had this absolute stain and ridiculousness of a trial.
Yeah, and a few other elements of this that were obviously biased or rigged, rather, were, as Will got into there, the judge had donated to President Joe Biden previously, which is against, I believe, the New York Code of Ethics for judges. And also his daughter is the head of this firm that does consulting exclusively for Democratic clients. And she had raised $93 million for some of these clients, in part relying on the fact that her dad was prosecuting Trump. I mean, it's truly unbelievable. And then you had Stormy Daniels' testimony, where despite saying consistently in her interviews and all of her public comments about her alleged sexual encounter with Trump, that it was fully consensual, that she was never paid for the act, that they just slept together because they both wanted to. When she gets on the stand, she introduces this sort of smear merchanting context where she claims that she might have passed out during the encounter, that she couldn't remember parts of it, essentially serving to suggest or imply that Trump had sexually assaulted her, which of course introduced the element of negative character witness when she was meant to be a fact witness to the affair that occurred. I would imagine that based on some of the objections that the defense raised during Stormy's testimony, that would be part of a potential appeal. But there's even more to the case as well that was wrong, besides the judge's bias and Stormy Daniels' testimony and Michael Cohen being allowed to testify and the jury instructions. But we'll let Ben jump in, as I'm sure he has some more examples to provide.
Well, just another element of it is that basically the judge gave the prosecution carte blanche to present any and every witness and all manner of innuendo and asinine assertions throughout the case, whereas the Trump team was not able to present its counter case. And this includes, of course, not being able to put up an election finance expert who would have provided testimony that clearly would have been exculpatory with regard to the non-alleged, but I guess alleged FEC purported violations here. And, Will kind of spoke to this. To one point of it is, okay, so if the underlying alleged offenses, which we don't even know what the jury ultimately picked from the menu of the three that turned a misdemeanor plus a misdemeanor somehow then into a felony and revived the original misdemeanor when the statute of limitations had lapsed on it, set all that aside. But if these were federal offenses, why was this disposed of in this court? Related to that, how could you possibly look to these offenses when neither the FEC nor the DOJ chose to bring associated charges? And this brings up another ironic element of this, which just points to one thing that I've been thinking about is, if you wanted to show that a legal system was entirely rigged and that you had no rule of law, what more could you do than what the regime did in this case, where you have a quote unquote novel, which is to say, never tried before in the history of the Republic, theory of the case, Frankenstein's monster of a case, which is built on the testimony of a serial perjurer and a porn star, where you don't give the defendant any of the protections that a defendant needs in our system. And you have a judge who contributes to the guy running against him and whose daughter makes millions of dollars effectively off of the persecution at play. What could you do more than what the regime did here, from judge and prosecution to jury, than what we saw here? But add to it this little nugget that Hillary Clinton herself, through the funding of the Steele dossier, truly misclassified records in connection with concealing dirty tricks, which were at the heart of Russiagate, the ultimate conspiracy to subvert a president and which violated the rights of myriad Americans, their most basic and fundamental rights. What happens? Well, the FEC does pursue her and she gets slapped on the wrist, fines associated with truly intentionally misclassifying the records associated with the funding of that disinformation campaign. But of course, no one else affiliated with it gets prosecuted. And this is, of course, the two-tier system. But I think it's ironic, of course, that once again, they are always responsible for the very things they claim their political opponents are responsible for doing. We can also talk about, obviously, as has been mentioned ad nauseum, the former number 3 from the Biden DOJ parachuting in to serve on Alvin Bragg's team. And you see the fingerprints of the Biden administration in all of the various prosecutorial efforts taking place, where you have the communications between Fani Willis's office and the Biden White House, for example, and then this case with Alvin Bragg. Worth noting, we're recording this on Tuesday. Attorney General Merrick Garland is testifying before the House Judiciary Committee today. He was asked by Matt Gaetz, will you, representing the DOJ, provide all of your communications with Tish James's office in New York, Alvin Bragg's office in New York, and Fani Willis's office? And he would not commit to provide all of those communications. And I think that speaks volumes about the fact that they have to cover up what really looks like a conspiracy to violate the rights, to use one of the charges they've used against Donald Trump, to violate the rights of Donald Trump and those in his orbit, and then also to subvert the election, engage in election interference at the highest levels. And the question is there any remedy for all of this at the end of the day? And we can get into that. And Trump, I think, put it most succinctly when he said that the voters will have the chance to render their own verdict in November. But given what we've seen from the regime to this point, you have to expect that there's going to be any and every attempt possible to make it impossible for voters to support Donald Trump on election day. And it puts us in a very perilous place, and a more perilous place than even I, who have been the alarmist on this, maybe the alarmist par excellence on this podcast from the start. Even though I fully expected and anticipated that there would be a horrific verdict here, and even having baked in the fact that this case should have never been brought in the first place, and we already far crossed the Rubicon way before we even got to the verdict. Even for me, my heart still sunk when the verdict was rendered. And I think because it's just a further illustration of the fact that the America that we thought we lived in and the America that we woke up in the morning before the verdict was handed down was different from the one that we live in after the verdict was handed down. And there's no going back. There's no ability to put the genie in the bottle. And we could talk about tit for tat, and we probably will, and what need be done to potentially operate and try to create some level of fairness and reciprocity in a post-America. But I think, to me, we're not the same country that has existed for 250 years, and I don't see how you can go back to it. And what is most troublesome to me is not just what the impact is today and on this particular campaign, but the fact that for generations now, our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren are not going to be living in anything remotely like the republic that we had the joy and the privilege to live in.
Yeah, I mean, couldn't agree more with your conclusion about what this says about the country. And we will get to what the response ought to be as opposed to how it'll affect the election. But before we move off some of the specifics of the trial, just wanted to add a couple things. One, the issue that Will brought up about the predicate of the predicate crime, right? Not requiring unanimity. I always have a hard time saying that word. Not requiring a unanimous verdict on what crime was actually the predicate of the crime that was committed. 2 points there. One, so the only sort of precedent that people are pointing to in New York for this kind of like split idea where you don't need to find the predicate crime in order to convict on the larger crime is burglary in New York. And apparently this issue has been litigated quite extensively in New York. And it's a totally different situation, and just thinking about it in a pragmatic way shows immediately why it's a totally different situation, right? Because in burglary, when you're breaking into somebody's house, there is no chance that you are like the act itself, first of all, is a crime of its own. And second, there is a very clear implication that if you're breaking into somebody's house, you're there to do something bad, right? And the fact that you were maybe arrested before you were able to, I don't know, steal, assault someone, right? Like that is what this structure was intended to deal with. So like if you have somebody breaks into a house, you don't have to prove that he was there specifically to steal the TV in order to convict of the felony. This is completely different, right? Because there's nothing wrong with hiding a hush money payment. There's nothing, I shouldn't say nothing wrong, maybe, but like nothing illegal inherently about what he was doing. It doesn't have the same implications at all as breaking into somebody's house. It is essentially how you classify different expenses. And while I'm on the subject of how you classify different expenses, the theory of this case, and I'm glad that Ben brought up Hillary and the dossier and everything else, which are obvious election interference. The overarching theory of this case was kind of about election interference, even though it's about, how these payments were classified. And the implication of this conviction is that anything that a candidate does to hide untoward information about himself from voters is somehow a crime. That if he doesn't report that information, that's clearly absurd, right? Every single politician who's ever run in the history of the world in any kind of democracy has tried to conceal unpleasant information about himself without reporting it on a government document. That's just like, it's an absurd conclusion, but it's the kind of conclusion that's necessary to take this like theory of the case seriously. So I guess a couple topics before we get to the actual politics and response to this. The first thing is, is Trump going to jail, right? Which could very much affect the election, if not for the reasons that I think the left thinks it will, in terms of swinging people's opinions, merely by, of course, like confining Trump, whether that's in his house or in Rikers. All the normal rules of the law would say that this is not a case in which somebody would need to go to jail, right? Nonviolent offense, first time offender. New York has very, very, lax laws about putting people back on the streets through bail reform, right? So there is absolutely no legal reason why that would be the case. But here we are obviously talking about this case that never should have been brought for all the reasons that Ben laid out initially, with the fact that this is like a totally novel theory that is in many ways completely illogical in terms of how politics operates, starting with that and going through all the things we've been talking about for the last 15 minutes. So given the fact that the judge is incredibly biased in this case and has shown himself to be that biased over and over again, do you think that Trump is going to jail in early July?
I want to jump on this because I think it is absolutely absurd, and it illustrates that many of the legal analysts, even those so-called on our side, who were wrong and thinking this would be a hung jury, they are operating under a paradigm that doesn't exist in America anymore, at least in jurisdictions like New York, which is this notion that, well, we know it's kind of a rigged process, and we know that these are political actors, but there are still restraints. There's still some sort of propriety that's going to be followed. So, Donald Trump, these are nonviolent crimes. They've never been charged before. Yeah, it was 34 counts, but it was really one that was split into 34 pieces or 33 other pieces. And, yes, this case was completely corrupted from the start. But somehow now Judge Merchan is going to be expected to show restraint and prudence and not try and incarcerate Donald Trump. How could you possibly come to that conclusion based upon everything that we've seen? So to me, the only restraint on Judge Merchan would be the political calculation that incarcerating Donald Trump or keeping him to home confinements that he can't run is going to generate such an awesome backlash that the political cost of doing so outweighs the glee, the joy, the zealotry on the left, and that it's somehow going to restrain, the left is going to restrain its appetites over this 4 days before the convention. I don't see it. I don't see any way that he doesn't take what we would consider to be the most asinine and incomprehensible and inconceivable kind of position with respect to incarceration. I guess we'll see what Alvin Bragg does, and maybe that would have some moderating effect. Although, again, I don't see how you could possibly come to that conclusion. Again, unless they see, well, Donald Trump's raising record amounts of dollars. There's massive political backlash. You have independents who are going on the Trump team. You have people who are lean Biden, and some percentage are saying we're going to lean Trump, and they have thumb in the air essentially. And that would be the thing that would restrain them. Otherwise, I don't see any way we don't get the most asinine possible sentencing imaginable. Please try and dissuade me and talk me off the ledge here, anyone who wants to do so.
I'll go next. My prediction, and I literally just came up with this, but I was just thinking about it. My prediction is a sense of home confinement along with a gag order, effectively preventing him from speaking. Here's my reasoning. I think Judge Merchan will impose the most extreme sentence he can that does not require enormous difficulty logistically on his part. And here's the logistical difficulty. I think actually incarcerating President Trump poses a real problem because of the Secret Service issues. And so if he does decide to do that, it will just be a whole pile of stuff that he has to sort through as the judge to figure out how to make incarceration work. Whereas if you put somebody on home confinement, you can also, this is one of the rules that I read about when I read Paul Manafort's book. If you're on home confinement, they can basically say to you, you don't get to talk publicly. You're in jail. You're in jail at home. That's what that means. And so I think that gets Merchan what he wants, right? He already demonstrated he really likes to shut Donald Trump up because he imposed the unconstitutional gag order pre-conviction. So I think home confinement accomplishes, if I'm sitting in Judge Merchan's shoes and I'm putting myself in his mind, and it's like, I want to hurt Donald Trump in the most elegant and simple way possible, like, to me, and that is a very straightforward way to do it from his perspective. So that's my prediction. I think, a sense of home confinement is obviously not justified. Obviously, this should be like, even in a normal world with a condition like this, you would see something like probation. But I think Merchan will see the opportunity to be like, haha, I have the discretion to, make Donald Trump stay at his house and not talk at all publicly. So
And they resist not putting him in handcuffs, though. That image.
Yeah.
If you were on the left, what is that image worth to you?
Yeah.
And I guess that's a good transition to the political on this, because, how is this going to play politically, since we've well established that this is not about the law, it's about politics. The mugshot they already got of Donald Trump arguably helped him a lot. And so far, it doesn't seem like the conviction, despite those polls saying that, some people will not vote for him if he's a convicted felon. When the details of this case became known, as far as I know, and I don't know if any of you have read the polls more broadly than I have, but I've seen a couple polls. It looks like he's actually ticking up in the polls right now. So it doesn't seem like it's having the desired effect. So how does this play politically? I agree with Will a lot. Like, that makes a lot of sense to me, your theory, Will, about the incarceration and the gag order. I think that does get them everything that they really want if they're smart. That would be the shutting him up, I think, is a more politically deleterious thing than getting him in a mugshot in jail, because Donald Trump does seem to have some special ability to have those things bounce off of him and in fact help him in the polls. So where do we think this is going from the political perspective, and how does the potential for Donald Trump to be off the campaign trail in this way, as well as the charge, the phrase convicted felon over and over again play in the election?
I think it's a little bit too early to put stock into any of the polls, especially the ones that were built on this hypothetical. Would you vote for Trump if he were a convicted felon? Hypothetical polls are almost always completely useless. So I think we're going to start to see a better idea of how exactly this is impacting him by next week or the week after, when we have a poll that is conducted purely after the conviction. Fox News does have an issues-based poll that just dropped that shows Trump still significantly ahead, double digits ahead of Joe Biden on the top issues for voters, like the economy, like immigration, like crime, which is obviously a huge problem for the Democrats. But I think the one thing we can look at that is illustrative right now are just the donations that have been pouring into the Trump campaign. According to Eric Trump, his father has raised more than $200 million from the time the conviction was handed down to yesterday, I believe. So the number is probably even higher now. And even more significantly, about 70 million of that came from small dollar donors, and 30% of those donors were people who did not have any prior political activity in terms of donating to candidates. So this is actually not just sparking motivation among existing Trump supporters and Trump's base, but from people who were perhaps a little bit more politically apathetic. They're actually opening up their wallets now and being willing to donate to this guy because they see what a grave injustice this was. And even if you just watch some of the liberal and progressive commentariat try to break down what exactly the crime was here, none of them can really articulate it properly. And so if you think of the people who are paid to be on television to say what the crime was can't articulate it, what does that mean for the average person on the street who was not paid to literally follow this trial and be able to offer some kind of professional commentary on it? If they don't have an idea of what the crime even was, then I think that definitely lends to them thinking that this was unjust or unfair in some fashion, even if they're not quite sure of what the specifics are in terms of the judge's donation or his daughter's consulting position, et cetera. So, I mean, politically, it just seems like all of the indications we have right now are it being a net positive for Trump. And even if they are able to paint him as a convicted felon, we've seen in the past that whenever the Democrats try to make an election solely about Trump, it doesn't work out for them. It ends up being actually a drag on them because they can't talk about issues. And yet we see Jen Psaki, the former White House press secretary, saying on MSNBC that Biden should make the election entirely about Trump and about being a convicted felon. And here's the other problem, which I know we're going to get into this later, but I think it's worth mentioning here, which is that Hunter Biden is currently on trial for felony gun charges for lying on a federal background check as to whether or not he was addicted to or a user of drugs at the time that he purchased his firearm. Based on the facts of the case, if it is a fair trial, the judge there seems to be quite less biased than Judge Merchan, then he would be a convicted felon. So how can the president talk about convicted felon Trump, my political opponent, if his own son is a convicted felon? So he has to be very careful here based on what happens in the Hunter Biden case that just started this week.
So I'll be really brief. I'm not prepared to necessarily forecast whether this is a net positive, negative, or nets out to neutral at the end of the day for Trump. We have seen that people who were on the sidelines and sort of afraid to get behind him are now foursquare behind him. And to your point, Amber, you've had tens of millions of dollars flow into the campaign's coffers. So it's certainly supercharged those who might have been semi-inclined or were reluctantly on board, and has pushed them firmly into the Trump camp. And maybe the acceleration in campaign funding will ultimately lead to a net more positive effect than whatever the negative is. I think, to me, the question is for wobbly voters or normie voters, are they going to hear convicted felon pounded into their heads every day through the campaign, and that will impact them negatively and lead them to reject Trump? Or will they be more compelled by the narrative, which I think is the truth, which is this is a rigged case and effectively the Biden-led regime smashed the justice system because they want to usurp total power and they'll stop at nothing to attain it? One other line, if I was advising on messaging, I would say that Joe Biden, if Trump's a convicted felon, Joe Biden's an unindicted co-conspirator in a conspiracy to interfere in the 2024 election and eviscerate the rights of Trump and everyone around him, and also take away the rights of tens of millions of voters who want to vote for him. Because remember, this regime was also behind trying to get Trump kicked off the ballot. So, which of those weigh more on voters' minds? To what extent are voters even aware of what transpired in this case, even at a rudimentary level? I suspect that at a gut level, some Americans are going to say convicted felon could never vote for him. And others are going to say they're trying to do everything to destroy this man. They never stop. They've continued it forever. And we don't want to live in a country like that. So we're going to vote for him as a middle finger to the regime. What wins out? I don't know, but that's kind of my simplistic analysis of it.
Yeah, I think the consequences of this, I'm willing to predict it. I think it'll ultimately be good for Trump. And I speak as someone who's on the DeSantis campaign and watched as we tried to deal with what happened with all the indictments. And it was just politically impossible. On our side, I think that's probably more pronounced in a primary, but the effect is still going to be similar in a general. Whatever people were, to the extent people were open to our message, that just went away once he got indicted, because it was a rally to the flag effect. People felt like the guy was being attacked. It was wrongful. They came to his defense in big numbers. And we went from, and if you actually look at the polling averages post indictment, that was Trump jumped 10 points after the indictment against us and never lost it. It just kept growing. And I'm already seeing, you see the first poll numbers come out, they're a little bit favorable to Trump. Essentially that he gained a bump. He was already ahead. I don't think people are going to like this. Just, it doesn't read well. They can't, but I think the fundamental problem with the lawfare attack on Trump in terms of its political consequences is you managed to extract a conviction, but you didn't convince the public he had actually done something wrong that led to that particular conviction. Like, if they can't publicly explain, here's the crime, then it doesn't look right. It doesn't look just. And I think, even though there are obviously problems with all the other prosecutions as well, they would have gotten more traction out of a January 6th conviction or another conviction, because they could say this was the specific conduct that was obviously criminal. And they could at least make a colorable argument to that effect. But here, they don't even have that. They basically have to rely on this hush money argument, but that's been part of the news since 2017. And it's also not criminal, obviously. And then the crime itself, as it was prosecuted, is so convoluted that it just doesn't really make sense. So all you're left with is abuse of power.
I think Amber made a great point in that this, partially because it's such a novel, ridiculous way of inventing a crime, it is also impossible to explain to people. And so, I think that just, if somebody is on the fence about deciding whether, let's say somebody's in the camp of thinking that Trump is generally a bad guy and having no, is easy to believe that Trump might have done something wrong for this particular voter. But then, at this point of conviction and not before, he actually looks at what Trump has actually been convicted of. I feel like somebody who's even moderately fair-minded towards Trump, who thinks he's a bad guy, has to look at these charges and say, and there's kind of no in between here, right? You either have to look at these charges and conclude that Trump is being politically railroaded in court. And I think the average American still thinks that's like a horrific thing. Or you have to conclude that this was like actually a bad thing that he did. And I feel like the facts of the situation, just don't, it's convoluted as well as obviously trivial. And that doesn't help them. And I agree with whoever said, I can't remember which one of you it was, but whoever said that some of the other cases surrounding, it was you, Will, surrounding January 6th or voting, I think even though they're ridiculous in their own ways, they still on a surface level carry more gravitas than Trump inscribed. At the end of the day, this is about how to categorize a payment to a porn star. And what Ben said is absolutely true, that everybody already knows about Stormy Daniels. We already had that round in our politics in 2017, right? So there's no new information to hurt Trump here. That being said, since we have already brought up the Hunter Biden trial, let's set up that discussion by saying, okay, so there's this Delaware trial. This is over the gun charge. This is the the pled down, right? Like, instead of charging Hunter Biden with anything that actually might include Joe Biden, we're doing the most basic charge, which is that he checked a box on a federal form, lied about his drug drug addiction and actively being on drugs while he was purchasing a firearm. This judge, though, as Amber mentioned, this judge is the one that rejected the agreement back several months ago. So the judge, at least in his case, will be seems to be pretty fair-minded. The jury, in terms of being in Delaware, I mean, Delaware is really known for two things: very low corporate taxes and easy corporate structure, and the Bidens. So, you know, in terms of the jury pool there, it's a good name. It's a good place to have the last name Biden in the country. But that, all of that being said, how do you think this is going to impact the election, if at all? And do you think that the law is going to be able to function in terms of convicting Hunter Biden, even though this trial itself is already like a piece of corruption, as in this is the smallest piece of what all the morass of investigating Hunter Biden produced, right? So this is already the favorable version to Hunter Biden. This is the thing he couldn't shift, is the fact that this is like this very clear and obvious crime. And apparently his defense is going to be, well, technically when I signed this document, I was sober for 2 hours. Like, that's going to be, I mean, like, just good luck as far as that goes. That being said, you know, this we've seen in the Trump case, this may not be about the law. It may be about politics.
Yeah, I actually think the bigger potential ramification of this case is separate from whether or not Hunter Biden ends up getting convicted or getting jail time, which I think is unlikely, the latter at least. But I think it's more about sort of poking a hole in this illusion that the Biden family is like the successor to the Kennedys, that Biden was just a normal guy, he's Scranton Joe, because we're already seeing these fissures within the family from a lot of the scandal that really followed Beau's death. Hallie, Beau's widow, of course, was engaged in this affair with Hunter at the time that he purchased his firearm. And she is really the one responsible for this even coming to police's attention, because she took the firearm out of Hunter's car and threw it in a grocery store trash bin. And then when Hunter got angry with her, she tried to get it back, found that it was missing, and told the grocery store owner, who called the police. And they came and declined to press charges against Hallie, actually, for stealing the gun. And it wasn't until IRS agents, federal investigators started going after Hunter for his tax evasion that they found this report and realized, hey, actually, Hunter Biden was an active crack addict at the time that Hallie was in trouble for stealing this gun. Last week, late at night, Joe Biden went to Hallie's house and had this private discussion with her, which was explained away as being a private visit ahead of the anniversary of Beau's death. But then the Bidens go to church on the actual anniversary date and go to visit Beau's grave, and who is missing? It's Hallie Biden. So she is obviously set to testify in the case about all of these fact patterns, and has the potential to reveal some pretty explosive information about Hunter's behavior at the time, about how Jill and Joe might have reacted to it. And I think there's just the potential for this whole illusion of surrounding the Biden family of being this sort of all-American blue-collar values family that's steeped in honesty. That's going to be really threatened, I think, by just the scandal that is going to surround the details of this case.
I think there could be some optically damaging aspects to come out of the case. We've seen it already with some of the emails that have been produced. Hunter Biden criticizing Jill Biden in a drug addicted and drunk stupor, seemingly. And there's going to be all sorts of things that I think remove the illusion for the American people, to the extent they want to see it, about the nature of the Biden family. And also maybe Hunter Biden himself will end up coming off as a tragic figure in some ways, used and abused by his family to serve as the bagman for their international influence peddling scheme. But of course, the whole point of this case, which only came about, as Inez noted, because the judge asked a few pointed questions about the sweetheart plea deal that the Biden DOJ brought to Hunter Biden, is that the case is part of the cover-up. The cover-up being no charges with any proximity to Joe Biden and the family's international influence peddling scheme. And so here you have this theater of the absurd of the DOJ trying to say, well, we were really tough on Hunter Biden when they weren't. And this case only exists now because the judge blew up the little sweetheart agreement that they had worked up. And then you have Hunter Biden, who in this case has tried to argue that the DOJ has been weaponized by House Republicans against him. He's arguing on a conservative Second Amendment position that based upon the Bruin Supreme Court case, he shouldn't be charged with these associated gun crimes. And it's just theater of the absurd from start to finish. So this is a pox on every house case is the way I see it. The California case, maybe to some extent less so because there's a closer nexus to the financial crimes, which clearly have a nexus to the Biden family international influence peddling scheme. But I suspect we will see every attempt at, there's the Chicago way. I think we'll see every attempt at there being a Wilmington way here from potential compromise of a jury, apparently which a majority of the jurors have someone in their family who's dealt with drug or alcohol abuse, which obviously seemingly should work in Hunter Biden's favor. But the case is in some ways a sideshow, but in other ways, it could be hung around Joe Biden's neck to the extent that you do get a conviction. And then Joe Biden is placed in the position of, is he going to pardon his son or not? And it'll be fascinating to see if we get there, but I wouldn't put any odds on it necessarily yet, despite the fact that the judge does seem to actually be fair and independent in this case.
With that, I think we'll go ahead and transition to final thoughts. And just to briefly touch on the last bit that Ben said about the jury and drug and alcohol addiction, I think we're going to have to be very careful in terms of talking about the Hunter Biden case. I think that totally cynical ploy that they're already rolling out with regard to Joe Biden just being, the loving father of a son who's struggling with the horrors of addiction. So many people in this country at this point, in no small part because of the open border policies of the Biden administration, but so many people know what that's like. I think it has to be, I think that's going to be a powerful argument, even though it's being deployed in such a transparently cynical way. And I think we ought to be aware of that. In terms of final thoughts, I have another depressing thought, right? We've been talking about the collapse of the law system with regard to Trump and how the courtroom has become a forum for politics. As with all of Trump's strongest arguments, it's not really about Trump. When the courts become this corrupted and the law becomes a tool of politics, it's everybody else who is more vulnerable in some ways than Trump. And one such person is Paulette Harlow in Washington, D.C., who was sentenced to 2 years in prison. She's a 75-year-old woman with health problems. She was sentenced for the actual crime that she committed was for quote unquote blocking the entrance of a DC abortion clinic. She was praying in the waiting room of the abortion clinic. Obviously, this kind of blockage is something we see pretty much weekly with the pro-Palestine protests all around the country in much more substantial ways, like, I don't know, blocking the airport loop at JFK, and launching balloons to shut down airport airspace. Those seem to be much more substantial and obvious disruptive protests that would merit this kind of prosecution. But of course, the person being prosecuted is a 75-year-old woman, and to add insult to injury, when her husband pled for a different sentence or a lighter sentence because he was worried that his wife would die in prison in these 2 years, his elderly wife with health problems. The judge actually mocked him and mocked her Christian faith, said basically, oh, I guess your wife will have to hang on there. And since she believes in life so strongly because her religion tells her to, I guess she'll just have to hang on in prison. Just really like ugly stuff. I actually read it just so you know that I'm not making it up. It's gonna take me too long to find, but that was a paraphrase, but it did give a spirit of the. I mean, it was like a really ugly mockery of like, oh yeah, well, I guess you believe in life so much, like we better try to hang on in prison. Just really bigoted, ugly stuff, and an obvious example of the way that the court system is not just weaponized. It's not just about Donald Trump. It is the politicization of the court system against people who hold opinions that the regime does not agree with. So on that sobering note, I'll turn it over to the rest of you for final thoughts.
Yeah, a news article or a news story came out yesterday that really struck me. In DC, not too far from where I used to live, there was a carjacking at a hospital. Apparently a female carjacker. We don't know her age, but she carjacked an SUV that was sitting in front of the hospital. The SUV had an elderly woman in the passenger seat. This carjacker was not deterred by that, drove off, and then crashed her car, murdering or killing the person sitting in the elderly woman in the passenger seat who was on her way to the hospital. And something about this is just like, you're struck by how depraved things have gotten in DC. I mean, this is not the first time you've had some depraved carjacking. I don't know if you guys remember the story from, I think, probably 1 or 2 years ago, where you had an Uber driver who was carjacked by 2 young teenagers in DC, and there was a video of them basically driving, basically holding a gun to their head and while the guy tried to drive away, and eventually they forced him to crash, and the Uber driver died. And it's like in our cities, we just have like this inability to like create even a culture where this stuff isn't acceptable. Like, it's one thing if it's like, okay, it's one carjacker, fine, that person's just a bad person. But no, there's an epidemic of carjacking in DC. There's a fundamental cultural problem, and there's a failure by the authorities to meaningfully defeat it, to do anything about it, to impose, to do sufficient work imposing harsh penalties to deter people from carjacking and to ensure that it stops. And it's like, okay, well, maybe American cities will just become unlivable under Democrat rule. But I'm long of the view that one of the things I hope Trump does, and that Republicans make a part of their platform, is to end DC home rule. There's no reason the continued home rule by the residents of DC has been a demonstrable failure. There's no reason they shouldn't be ruled by Congress. If they've decided to live in a federal jurisdiction, it should be federal authority that governs them, and then the federal government can only ultimately take responsibility for ensuring that this endless violence and carjacking that we see in our nation's capital comes to an end.
I'll jump in here, and I did find the quote that Inez was talking about, just so viewers can see how evil this posture was from the judge. She said in response to Paulette Harlow's husband begging for mercy that maybe she would, quote, make an effort to remain alive because that is a tenet of her religion. So yes, simultaneously mocking the potential that she would die in prison and her Christian faith. So beyond despicable. My final thoughts are that Joe Biden is signing an executive order on immigration, which we were told for months he couldn't do, that he needed an act of Congress to make any changes to the border. So it's pretty incredible that they just found this out. But he will restrict asylum seeking between ports of entry if illegal encounters reach 2,500 migrants a day, which obviously we will almost certainly be at within a day of him signing this order. It's a good start, but it's wholly inadequate to deal with the full crisis that we're seeing. One immediate red flag to me as I was reading through the details is that this excludes unaccompanied minors and victims of trafficking. And if you know anything about the border, you know that the vast majority of people who come across, if not all of them, are only allowed across if the cartel gives permission. So in that sense, every single illegal alien who makes it across the southern border is a victim of trafficking. I can see very well that the Democrat Party, as shameless as they are, will absolutely use that loophole to continue to allow asylum seekers between ports of entry. And then on the unaccompanied minors, if you're not counting them, then you're only incentivizing, of course, people sending their kids across the border by themselves through dangerous conditions to be taken advantage of, raped, trafficked, etc., by the cartel. And you're going to end up with the kind of humanitarian crisis we saw with unaccompanied minors in 2014 under the Obama administration. You'll see more people claiming children that aren't theirs. You will see massive amounts of chain migration as adults follow their kids into the United States. And functionally, it's not going to change a whole lot about the numbers of people coming across the border. So again, this is inadequate. It's intended to seem like Biden is finally doing something, but the details of it, the devil of is in the details in this case. And I haven't been able to read through the full thing yet, but those are just my initial thoughts on Biden's executive order on immigration.
I just want to reference a trio of related pieces touching on the censorship industrial complex worth your time. The first one was a piece I worked on for months, really, on it's at Real Clear Investigations, came out last week. It's titled Stanford, Silicon Valley, and the Rise of the Censorship Industrial Complex. And what I do in the piece is kind of trace the rise of what was called by Senator William Fulbright, building on Eisenhower's formulation, the military industrial academic complex, which was a pivotal sort of alliance or partnership towards first combating the Nazis and then the communists. What I show in this piece is that it morphed into one that now targets dissenting Americans and their speech, but basically that the links between the national security apparatus, major research institutions like Stanford, and even defense contractors, and then the NGO archipelago sort of around them, that there's a decades-long history, and the rise of this and the targeting first of our actual adversaries, but now of Americans like adversaries, represents or kind of tracks with the corruption of our ruling regime in many respects. Related to that, Jacob Siegel, who maybe wrote the definitive piece on the moral panic over disinformation and the use of the censorship industrial complex to monopolize narrative on the one hand and silence dissenting narratives on the other hand, he wrote a great piece at Unheard, which talks about how U.S. policy towards Iran and the attempt to make Iran the strong course in the Middle East under the Obama-Biden administration and now under the Biden administration, and essentially subordinating much of our foreign policy essentially to that Iran first and U.S.-Iran alliance, led to the creation of the Iran deal echo chamber, which created the networks and the apparatus that has been used to run many domestic information operations by the regime against the American people, including Russiagate, including the Hunter Biden laptop suppression, and morphing into a whole slew of other narratives as well. So well worth your time in understanding sort of the recent developments of the censorship regime. And then last but not least, James Bovard has a great column in the New York Post speaking about Merrick Garland and the administration's attempts to hide the audio recordings of Robert Hur's interview with Joe Biden. And one of the rationales that the DOJ uses to suppress the audio, despite the fact that now we know that the transcript essentially censored out lots of repetitions of words, ums, other fillers, according to officials at least. They say that they don't want to release it because of fears over generative AI, that people are going to take the audio and manipulate it for nefarious political ends. Generative AI is something that many members of the censorship industrial complex have been talking about, fear-mongering over when it comes to 2024 elections, both in the U.S. and abroad. And James Bovard has some excellent insights into how dangerous and nefarious this is, and how generative AI is going to be leveraged as a justification to suppress basically anything the Biden White House and the ruling regime doesn't want out there in the 2024 election. So trio of pieces that I think are well worth your time.
And on that note, on behalf of Will, Ben, and Amber, thanks for tuning in. I'm Inez Stepman, and we'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.